She was hired to scrub floors. She was forbidden from going near the child. She had no medical degree, no credentials, no money, just a plastic container of homemade soup and a lullaby her grandmother once taught her. But within one afternoon, she did something $2 million could not do in 23 days. And when the most powerful criminal in Chicago discovered who she really was, his whole world shattered, because the stranger he almost destroyed was the last gift his dead wife ever left him. This channel is home to stories of mafia bosses, hidden love, and the quiet miracles that happen inside broken families. Remember, fate doesn't knock twice. Franco almost missed his forever. Don't miss yours like this video. Share it with someone you love, leave a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss a story that might just change your life.
There, in the center of his expensive kitchen, a young woman in a baggy navy blue maid's uniform knelt in front of his daughter. It was not the $5,000 a day nurse. It was not the nutritionist with a doctorate. It was just a cleaning lady they had hired that morning, whose name he had never asked. She wore bright yellow rubber gloves, the type for cleaning bathrooms and washing floors, and held a cheap plastic spoon, the kind you get 10 for $1. And Lily, his Lily, had her mouth open. The little spoon entered. Her small throat worked to swallow. Then, the child's chapped lips, which had been still for 23 long days, moved and shaped a single word. More. Franco Castellano, the crime boss before whom all of Chicago knelt, the man who bowed to no one, fell to his knees right there in his kitchen entrance. Who was this woman in the yellow gloves? How had she succeeded where a $2 million medical staff had failed? And why did the aroma from that simple soup in a worn plastic bowl smell just like his wife, who was now 6 feet under the ground? Franco's knees hit the cold marble, but he felt nothing. The cold that should have pierced his expensive Italian pants meant nothing next to the inferno blazing inside him. He tried to get up. His legs would not obey. 23 sleepless nights spent watching his daughter wither away like a dying rose, yelling at doctors and menacing specialists, had left him empty. He grabbed the doorframe, his knuckles turning white, and forced himself to his feet. The scent was all around him, like an embrace from a spirit. Mint, chicken stock, star noodles. All at once, Franco was not in his $3 million kitchen anymore. He was transported 3 years into the past, on a Sunday, entering the little utility kitchen Elena had made her own. She stood by the stove, her designer dress protected by an apron, stirring a beat-up old pot that seemed to be from a second-hand shop. That same aroma filled the tiny room. It smelled of herbs, of slow cooking, of love, and of struggle. Franco had crinkled his nose in distaste. "Why are you making poor people's food? We employ a chef. We have the best of everything." Elena had faced him, her dark eyes gentle, with a slight smile on her face, because Lily needs to understand what love tastes like, Franco, not what wealth tastes like. He had sneered at her words, and then he left. Now, standing in that doorway, with that same smell overwhelming him, Franco would have traded his whole criminal enterprise just to hear her voice again. The vision from the past was broken when the woman in the yellow gloves started to hum a tune. It was a simple, old lullaby, the type mothers pass to their children for generations when a song is all they have to offer. Franco didn't know the tune, but he felt it deep inside his soul. And then Lily, his daughter, who had been like a vacant porcelain doll for 23 agonizing days, did the impossible. The edge of her lip curved up. It was not a complete smile, not quite, but it was life. It was a flicker of light in the darkness she had created. Franco's breathing stopped. He longed to run to her, to hold his daughter tight, to cry into her hair and plead with her to come back to him. But he was cemented to the spot, paralyzed by fear. He worried that any movement, any sound from him, would break this delicate moment. The woman in the yellow gloves would fall silent. Lily would shut her mouth once more, and that tiny spark of hope would vanish completely. And so Franco Castellano, The man who could order a hit without blinking, who created a kingdom from violence and intimidation, stood motionless in his kitchen, scared of the sound of his own feet. A sudden shriek shattered the silence. "What in the world do you think you are doing?" Nurse Patricia Coleman burst in through a side door, her phone in her hand, her expression a mask of indignation. She had witnessed the whole scene through the glass. The young woman in the yellow gloves whipped around, her eyes filled with fright. The plastic spoon fell from her hand and bounced loudly on the marble. Soup splashed onto the perfect white floor. Then her eyes met Franco's. All the color left her face. Her mouth opened, but she was speechless. In her gaze, Franco recognized the primal terror of a person with nothing, who was about to lose even that. But Franco wasn't looking at the maid. His eyes were fixed on Lily. His daughter was looking at the dropped spoon, her small hand reaching for the spot where the woman had just been. Her lips moved again, creating the word she had not uttered for 23 days. More. And for the first time since Elena's casket had been put into the cold Chicago soil, a single tear traced a path down Franco Castellano's face. To grasp the weight of that one tear, heavier than all the blood he had ever caused to be shed, you have to go back 23 days, to when his entire life crumbled. That morning, the Chicago wind was sharp enough to cut skin. The sky was a heavy gray blanket, as if nature itself was in grief. Oak Hill Cemetery lay before the crowd, tombstones jutting from the snow like jagged teeth. Franco was at the graveside, dressed in a black Armani suit, his expression as hard as stone. He shed no tears. He showed no weakness. The crime boss, who had laid his own father to rest at 12 years old, understood that crying was a weakness he could not permit himself. Next to him, Lily held onto her mother's silk scarf, a light blue one that held the lingering scent of Chanel. Her little hands were wound so tightly around the material that her knuckles were white. She watched the oak casket hanging above the icy ground, her dark eyes wide and not understanding. A priest said some words, but Franco heard none of them. As the coffin was lowered, Lily did not make a sound. She just went dark, like a light bulb popping. 1 second, a 4-year-old girl was beside her father. The next, there was just an empty vessel that breathed and blinked, but was vacant inside. Franco saw it happen, but he couldn't comprehend it. Not then. For the first 3 days, he chalked it up to shock. Kids handle loss in their own way. The psychologist advised, just give her space. She will recover. On the 4th day, Lily would not eat breakfast. Her nanny offered oatmeal, pancakes, even her favorite yogurt with strawberries. Lily just looked away, facing the wall. By day 7, she had stopped drinking. Her lips started to chap, her face lost its color. Franco dismissed that nanny and brought in 3 others. On day 10, Dr. Harrison Webb, who had been the family doctor for 3 generations of Castellanos, put an intravenous line into Lily's little arm. Nutrients flowed into her body as she lay still in her princess bed, with plush toys that couldn't bring her joy anymore. Day 14, day 17, day 20. Franco poured money into the problem with the force of a wildfire. He brought in top child specialists from Johns Hopkins. He hired experts in nutrition, therapy, and even hypnosis. Franco filled her room with every toy a child could dream of, creating a personal wonderland and promising her ponies and castles, or whatever she might want. Lily remained completely unresponsive. On the 22nd day, Dr. Webb took Franco aside. The elderly doctor looked drained, his face a mask of exhaustion and defeat. Her body is shutting down, Mr. Castellano. This is beyond what medicine can do. This is something different. Franco grabbed the doctor's coat, pulling him off the ground. I will give you $10 million to save my little girl. Tell me your price. I will pay anything. Dr. Webb looked at him with profound sadness. Sir, some things cannot be purchased with money, and your daughter's desire to live is one of them. Later that night, Franco found himself standing outside Lily's room. The hall was completely dark. The only sound in the giant house was the soft, steady beep from the heart monitor next to her bed. He leaned his forehead on the cool wooden door and whispered out to the shadows. Elena, are you trying to take her from me? Is this your way of leaving me with absolutely nothing? Silence was his only reply, except for the constant rhythm of the machine, ticking away the final moments of his daughter's life. Franco Castellano was no ordinary person, and the world he controlled was far from ordinary. The Castellano estate crowned Gold Coast Hill, a palace watching over its kingdom. It had 30 rooms on 4 levels, with massive windows that stared out at the endless gray expanse of Lake Michigan. The design was a fortress hidden inside a mansion, with steel-reinforced concrete behind the fine Italian marble and bulletproof glass in every window. A bomb shelter was buried deep below the wine cellar. 20 armed guards were always on patrol, working in shifts. A network of surveillance cameras watched every part of the estate, all feeding into a security hub that never slept. Motion detectors secured the entire perimeter. Hidden panic buttons were installed under every single table. This was the command center for the entire South Chicago underworld. For 15 years, Franco had ruled with a perfect mix of charm and brutality. He controlled gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets. Not one illicit dollar moved through the south side of the city without passing through his control. Other families had risen up to challenge him. Those people now lay in unmarked graves or rested at the bottom of Lake Michigan. But an empire, just like a person, can rot from the inside out. Since Elena passed away, Franco had let his kingdom crumble. He ignored meetings. He never answered his phone. The usual line of lieutenants and captains who wanted his advice stopped coming, because everyone knew the boss could not be reached. Vincent Moretti, who had been Franco's most loyal enforcer for 20 years, appeared at the study door one night. His rugged face was lined with deep worry. "Boss, the Irish are making a move on the north side. They have already seized 3 of our betting parlors. The Russians are circling us as well. They can sense our weakness." Franco just sat in his huge leather chair, his eyes fixed on the security screen showing Lily's room. His little girl was perfectly still in her bed, connected to machines that kept her alive. "Let them have it all," Franco muttered, his voice empty. Vincent moved closer. "Boss, if we show no response, it will be seen as a sign of weakness. All our work for 15 years, I said, let them have it all." The words filled the room with a sense of doom. In 15 years, Franco Castellano had never backed down. He had never shown any weakness. He had never ignored a single insult. But what good was a kingdom without a princess to inherit it? Every single night, Franco lingered by Lily's door, unable to make himself go inside. He would place his hand flat against the door, trying to feel the hum of the machines and listening to the beeping that told him his daughter was still alive. He was terrified to open that door, scared that he would find her gone, with alarms blaring as the medical staff rushed around a body that had already given up. So he just stood there in the dark and did something he had not done since he was 12 years old, since the evening he saw his own father die on a warehouse floor. He prayed, "God, if you are there, you can take it all. Take my entire empire. Just do not take my daughter." The reply arrived on day 22, but it did not come from God. The heart monitor suddenly screamed. The alarm sliced through the quiet mansion. Franco threw the door open with such force it almost came off its hinges. He yelled for Dr. Webb, for the nurses, for absolutely anyone. Lily's tiny frame shook violently once, then twice, before going completely still. 30 seconds of frantic chest compressions. 30 seconds while Franco's entire existence fell apart. 30 seconds of pleading with every god he had ever dismissed. And then, a single heartbeat. Dr. Webb wiped the sweat from his face, his hands visibly shaking. "She is stable, but only for the moment." He faced Franco, his expression heavy with a terrible truth. "You have about a week, Mr. Castellano. Possibly less time. She is giving up." Franco dropped to his knees at his daughter's bedside. He gently picked up her tiny hand, which felt so small, fragile, and cold, and brought it to his lips. "I will give anything," he whispered, "no matter what it takes, no matter the price." He had no idea that the solution to his impossible problem was just 45 minutes away. In a rundown apartment on the south side, in a place that seemed like a different universe, a young woman sat on a worn-out mattress, counting her money. Aurora Hayes laid out the coins on the stained sheet. 3 quarters, 4 dimes, and 7 pennies. It was $1.22, every penny she had to her name. The entire room was barely 15 square meters. A web of cracks ran up the walls like old, tired veins. A large water stain marked the ceiling from a persistent leak in the roof. Cockroaches moved freely in the corners, not even trying to conceal themselves anymore. The heater had broken 2 winters before, and the landlord gave up on fixing it long ago. This was her home. On a small bed across the room, an old woman was propped up on thin pillows. Her eyes were lost in the haze of Alzheimer's. Martha Hayes was 82, but her mind had drifted back to a much earlier time. She looked at Aurora with a gentle, puzzled smile. "Sarah, is that you? Did you remember my pills?" A pang of sadness hit Aurora. Sarah was her mother's name. Her mother had been gone for 12 years. "It's just me, Grandma. It's Aurora." Martha's smile briefly disappeared, then came back, empty. "Oh, Sarah, you were always such a wonderful girl. Your father should be back from work soon." Aurora glanced at the money in her hand and then at the empty medicine bottle on the small table. Her grandmother's medication was $47 for a 2-week supply. Basic food for the week would cost at least $15. She had $1.22. Should she buy medicine, or should she buy food? It was never enough for both. This terrible decision haunted her every month, every week, and every single day. But it was not a real choice. It never was. 6 months earlier, Aurora had thought her life could not get any worse. She was mistaken. The memory appeared without warning. The cold floor of the public clinic, the buzzing of the overhead lights, and the blood that she felt. The loan sharks that her ex-husband owed money to had tracked her down. They sent a message using their fists and feet while she cried out for help that did not arrive. When she woke up, she knew everything just by looking at the doctor's face. She was 5 months pregnant with a child she had already secretly named. A child she had whispered to in the night, promising a life so much better than her own. It was gone. Aurora did not shed a tear that night. She had not cried at all since then. She had no more tears to give. A sudden knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it and saw a woman in a worn-out blazer holding a clipboard. The logo on her folder from the employment agency was peeling. "Aurora Hayes? I have a job opening. It is a live-in position for domestic assistance, in one of those huge houses on the north side. The pay is—" The woman looked down at her papers, extremely generous. Extremely, many times the usual pay. Aurora's gaze sharpened. "So what is the downside?" The woman paused. "The person hiring is— well, his name is Franco Castellano." That name hit the air and silenced the room. Everyone from the south side knew that name and the dark secrets associated with it. He was a mob boss who preferred the title of businessman. The woman gave a slight shrug. "Listen, my job is to inform you. What you decide to do is your own business." Aurora glanced over at her grandmother, who was singing softly to someone who was not there. She saw the empty pill bottle, the pile of late notices crammed in a drawer, and the eviction paper tacked to the wall. "What time should I be there?" 6 o'clock in the morning. After the woman departed, Aurora knelt by her bed and retrieved a little wooden box from under a loose floorboard. A photograph was inside, its corners soft from being held so many times. 2 young girls were smiling in the sun, one with dark hair and one with light hair. They were cousins but were as close as sisters. On the back, in a child's messy script, it said, "Aurora, I am always with you. Elena, Elena Castellano." That was before she was Elena Reyes, before she entered a world of wealth and influence that Aurora could not imagine. Elena always found ways to send letters and tuck away cash for her. She never forgot her roots. The same Elena who was buried 23 days ago. Aurora clutched the picture to her heart, her voice a quiet promise in the still room. I am on my way, Elena. I just wish I had not been too late. Aurora came to the Castellano property using the staff entrance, a small gate tucked away behind perfectly shaped bushes, hidden from the main drive. The gate was meant to be overlooked, much like the staff who used it. She walked onto the property, and her breath caught in her throat. The mansion stood before her like a castle from a forgotten time. It was a 3-level mansion of white stone and shining windows that reached for the overcast Chicago sky. Just the front yard was bigger than her whole city block. Marble fountains from Italy were quiet in the cold air, their water shut off until springtime. Her tiny apartment could probably fit in here 100 times, if not more. A woman wearing a starched black uniform stepped out from a side entrance. Her gray hair was pulled into a bun so severe it pulled at her features. She held a clipboard and had a look on her face that said Aurora had already failed some unspoken test. You must be the new hire from the agency. This was a statement, not a question. My name is Irene Crawford. I am the head of housekeeping. You will call me Mrs. Crawford, and that is all. Aurora gave a nod. Yes, Mrs. Crawford. The woman walked around her, looking her over as if she were a piece of farm equipment. Without asking, she grabbed Aurora's hands and flipped them over to check her palms, her fingers, and her nails. Are your fingernails clean? Do you have any contagious illnesses? A police record? No, ma'am. I have none of those. Mrs. Crawford wrote something on her clipboard. Her lips formed into a flat line of displeasure. Aurora was not sure what she was displeased about. Maybe it was everything about her. Come with me. Inside the mansion, Aurora felt the last of her breath leave her. The marble floors were so polished, she saw her own reflection looking up. She looked like a phantom in old shoes and used clothing, a complete mismatch for this palace of money. Yet under all the beauty, something felt deeply wrong. The atmosphere was dense and chilly, and the quiet was so complete it felt like a pressure on her eardrums. There were no voices in the hallways. There were no sounds of movement. This place was not a home. It was a tomb, gorgeous on the surface, but full of sorrow inside. Mrs. Crawford took her to a little room near the service hall and gave her a navy blue uniform that was a bit too big, along with yellow rubber gloves. These are the regulations, Mrs. Crawford said, her tone as cutting as shattered glass. You will not look Mr. Castellano in the eye. You will not speak unless he speaks to you first. When you see him coming, you make yourself scarce. Hide in a closet, find a corner, go to another room. I do not care how, simply become invisible. Aurora nodded without a word. And the most important rule, Mrs. Crawford moved in closer, her gaze drilled into Aurora. You are forbidden from going to the East Wing. There are no exceptions. The child's room is there. Do not go near that area. Do not look toward it. Do not even let it cross your mind. Do you understand me? Yes, Mrs. Crawford. The older woman watched her for a moment, looking for the smallest hint of rebellion. She found none and gave a short, sharp nod. Here are your tasks for today, scrub the bathrooms for the guests, clean the floors in the service hallways, shine the kitchen windows. Start your work now. Aurora put on the uniform in a supply room that smelled like cleaning chemicals and old memories. The uniform was baggy on her slender body, and the rubber gloves made a noise against her hands. She saw herself in a mirror leaning on the wall. She was unrecognizable. Perfect. She was comfortable with being unseen. The day went by in a haze of cleaning and buffing. Aurora did her work without a sound, and the other workers barely noticed her as they walked by. She was almost done cleaning the east hallway when she detected a sound. A beep. The steady, electronic beep of a hospital machine. The sound was coming from the forbidden east wing, from behind a door at the hall's end. Aurora gripped the handle of her mop tighter. Then she heard voices, two nurses talking quietly nearby. It has been 3 days since she last cried. That is a very bad sign. It is terrible. I agree. A child who stops crying has lost all hope. A pain shot through Aurora's chest. Her mind went to her own baby, the one that never took a first breath, whose eyes never opened, whose first sound was never heard, the baby she lost on the floor of a chilly hospital as people walked past her. Her child also made no sound, because some farewells are quiet. The confrontation she was told to avoid happened only 3 hours into her shift. She was down on her knees in the grand entrance hall, cleaning the marble with a worn-out scrub brush. Next to her was a pail of murky water, filled with the grime she had scrubbed off the floor. Her back and knees were in pain, but she continued her work, unnoticed and quiet, just as instructed. The main entrance flew open with force. Franco Castellano blew in like a human storm. His expression looked like it was chiseled from stone. His jaw was so tight that a muscle twitched in his cheek. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, surrounded by circles so dark they resembled bruises. He had just left another appointment with Dr. Webb, with more difficult news. It was another step closer to the unavoidable outcome. Aurora noticed him an instant too late. She rushed to collect her things and disappear, just like Mrs. Crawford instructed, but her movements were not fast enough. Her body did not react in time. Franco's handmade Italian shoe, worth $5,000, kicked the side of her pail. Soapy water went everywhere on the clean marble floor. Some of it landed on his shoes, staining the fine material like spreading blood. An intense quiet filled the air afterward. Franco froze. He glanced down at his damaged shoes. Then his eyes moved to Aurora, who was still on her knees, gripping her brush with white knuckles. He stared at her with the same disgust one would have for an insect on their food. "Who allowed you in this area?" His tone was low and steady, which was far more frightening than if he had yelled. Aurora tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked whisper. "I am so sorry, sir. It is my first day. I did not notice Mrs. Crawford." He kept his voice down. He did not have to shout. In a moment, the head housekeeper appeared from another hallway, her face white with fear. "Mr. Castellano, I am so sorry. She just began working this morning." Franco raised one hand, and Mrs. Crawford immediately stopped talking. "Inform her of the policies," he said. Every word he spoke landed with the heavy impact of a rock thrown into a quiet water. "And find her some different shoes. The squeak of that cheap rubber on my floors is like nails on a chalkboard." As he started to walk away, Aurora felt a brief moment of relief. But then he stopped. And Mrs. Crawford. He did not turn around. "Keep her away from Lily. My daughter will not be exposed to the stench of poverty these people bring in from the streets." His words struck her like a physical blow. Aurora remained completely still, her gaze locked on the puddle as Franco's steps receded into the grand house. A door slammed in the distance, followed by an empty silence. Miss Crawford loomed over her, her stiff posture radiating disapproval. "Clean this mess, then go to the service quarters for a new assignment." With that, the housekeeper left, leaving Aurora with the dirty water and the sharp sting of her own humiliation. Aurora slowly lifted her chin. She looked down the hall where Franco had gone, her eyes blurring with tears she would not allow to fall. She had been called worse things before. She had certainly been treated worse, yet his casual brand of cruelty, the simple way he had just erased her very presence, hurt more than she had anticipated. Then, she recalled Elena's voice, a whisper from a letter she had read until the words were memorized. "Franco has a kind heart. You just have to look for it." Aurora pushed back her tears and grabbed her brush. But how far down was it buried? And was there anything left under all that ice that was worth finding? It was 3 in the morning. The servants' area was shrouded in darkness, but sleep would not come for Aurora. The mattress felt thin and lumpy. The room was freezing, as the main heating clearly did not reach this forgotten part of the house. She was curled up under a blanket that smelled like mothballs, just staring at the darkness above. She had to move, to get some air. Aurora slid out of her bed and padded into the corridor. The mansion was an entirely different place at night. Long shadows gathered in every corner. Blades of moonlight cut through the tall windows, making every floorboard creak sound like a ghostly whisper. That is when she heard it, not the steady beep of medical machines. This was different. It was singing. The voice was hoarse and fractured, unable to hold a single note. It had no real tune, just pure desperation given sound. Aurora followed the sound to the off-limits east wing. A door was slightly open, and a soft light spilled out. She peeked through the small opening. There, Franco Castellano was hunched over his daughter's bed. His wide shoulders were slumped forward, his back bent like an old man broken by sadness. The formidable mob boss who had treated her like trash was now a hollowed-out shell of a man. He was trying to sing a lullaby. The words were jumbled and the melody was gone. He obviously did not know the song. Maybe he had never sung to his daughter before Elena passed away, but he was trying his best. Lily was perfectly still, her tiny frame barely making a shape under the blankets. Her skin was pulled tight over her bones, a sight no child should ever be. In her small hand, she held a silk scarf, a pale blue one with the letter E stitched into its corner. It was Elena's scarf. Franco's song faltered and then stopped. He leaned down and pressed his lips to his daughter's forehead. "Please do not leave me, Lily." His soft words reached her through the crack. "Daddy cannot do this without you." His voice shook with the fear of a small boy in the dark. Aurora pulled back, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob that was rising in her chest. He was not a monster. He was just a father watching his little girl fade away. She ran back to her room, tears now freely running down her face. She knew this kind of pain. 6 months ago, she had also sung lullabies, not to a sick child, but to her own round belly that carried all of her dreams. And then there was blood, followed by a quiet where a heartbeat should have been. Franco Castellano was losing his child. Aurora had already lost her own. In that moment of shared heartbreak, an unseen connection formed between them. It was day 23, late in the afternoon. Aurora was tasked with washing the kitchen windows, the very room where things were about to shift. She was perched on a stepladder, the squeak of her yellow gloves on the glass marking slow, circular motions. Down below, a drama was unfolding that she was meant to tune out. Nurse Patricia Coleman was at Lily's high chair, trying to feed her a spoonful of a gray, pasty substance. The girl was like a statue, a little wax doll with vacant eyes that saw nothing. The machines around her beeped out a steady rhythm. "Lily, you must eat." Patricia's tone was all business. No clinical annoyance. "If you refuse to eat, the feeding tube goes back in. You remember how much that hurts, right?" Lily gave no reaction, no sign that she had even heard the woman speak. Patricia made another attempt, pushing the spoon to the girl's tightly closed lips. The gray paste just smeared across her mouth, uneaten. The nurse cleaned it off with robotic precision. "All right, do it your way." Just then, Patricia's phone vibrated. She checked the screen, looked at the girl, then back at her phone. With a deep sigh, she put the spoon down. "I am coming right back. Do not go anywhere." Her attempt at a joke was met with silence. Patricia went out a side door, already putting the phone to her ear. Aurora's hands froze on the window pane. She looked down at Lily, really seeing her for the first time. The little girl was just skin and bones. Her skin was stretched so tight over her frame that her bones stuck out at sharp angles. Her dark hair was thin and dull. Her eyes, which were so bright in the family photos, were now completely lifeless. And then Aurora noticed it. A single tear made its way down Lily's cheek. It was silent, and no one wiped it away. The child made no noise at all. There was just that one tear, leaving a wet trail through the paste on her face, a tear that had no voice. A tightness grew in Aurora's chest, and her own eyes began to water. 6 months ago, she had been on a hospital floor, bleeding and alone, invisible as people walked past her. Nobody helped. Nobody even looked. She had lost her baby in total silence, surrounded by people who saw nothing worth helping. She glanced at the red blinking light of the security camera. She glanced at the door Patricia had just used. She looked at the child who was slowly fading away in her chair. Aurora climbed off the ladder. Her body moved on its own. She went to her bag in the corner of the room and took out a plastic container. It held her lunch, a chicken soup with little star-shaped noodles and fresh mint. It was her grandmother's recipe, the one she and Elena learned as little girls in a tiny kitchen that always smelled of love, not money. Aurora was fully aware of the consequences if she was discovered. Miss Crawford would dismiss her on the spot. She would have no job, no money for her grandmother's medicine, nothing at all. She looked at Lily again. The child was still, that one tear still wet on her cheek, waiting for nothing. Aurora had already watched one child disappear into silence, her own, the one she never held. She refused to let it happen again. Not this time, never again. She opened the container, and the smell of mint and warm chicken broth filled the sterile kitchen like a quiet hope. Franco was still on his knees, tears flowing freely down his face. The most powerful man in Chicago was on his own marble floor, crying like a lost boy, unable to look away from his daughter. Aurora was frozen by Lily's high chair, the spoon she held dripping soup onto the perfect floor. Her heart was pounding inside her chest. Everything in her screamed to run and become invisible again, just as she had been taught. But her feet were cemented to the spot. The side door flew open. Nurse Patricia came rushing back in, her phone still in her hand. She surveyed the scene, Franco on the floor, Aurora with the child, the unfamiliar soup, the dropped spoon, and her face twisted into a mask of professional fury. "Mr. Castellano." Patricia's sharp voice cut the tension. "This woman has given your daughter something I did not approve. I have no idea what is in that food. It might be spoiled. It could even be poison." Franco's crying stopped. His jaw clenched. He got to his feet, rising like a gathering storm. A deep chill seized Aurora. This was it, the moment she feared, the rage of a crime boss aimed at a nobody who had dared to touch his sick child. Franco started walking toward her. Each step was heavy, a drumbeat of doom. Aurora backed away until the cold metal of the refrigerator was at her back. She looked down, ready for whatever was coming, a shout or a strike. She did not know what to expect, but Franco did not even look at her. He looked right past her, at Lily. The little girl was doing something she had not done since the day they buried her mother. Her small arm was reaching out, her fingers stretching toward Aurora, grasping at the air. More. The word was a tiny whisper. "Please." The single word from Lily's cracked lips was almost a whisper. Franco's heart stopped. He had convinced himself he would never hear that small, fragile voice again. A voice that had been silent for 23 days, trapped behind a grief too immense for a 4-year-old. His daughter had finally spoken. Franco slowly turned to Aurora, his eyes exhausted and red. He studied her face as if for the first time. "Where did you get this recipe?" Aurora's voice shook. "It was my grandmother's, sir." "Your grandmother," Franco repeated, his gaze growing sharper. "Where was she from?" "West Side, sir. We grew up there." The words hit him like stones dropped in a quiet pond. West Side, the neighborhood where his late wife, Elena, was born. The streets she had known before she married into a world of marble and designer clothes. Franco stared at Aurora for a long moment. A new thought began to replace his suspicion. He turned to Mrs. Crawford, who stood in the doorway, her face a mask of confusion. "This woman stays," Franco said, his voice leaving no room to argue. "From now on, her only job is to take care of Lily." Patricia's jaw dropped. "Mr. Castellano, this is completely inappropriate. I must object." "You are fired," Franco said, not even glancing her way. "Collect your things and leave." Mrs. Crawford stepped forward. "Sir, are you sure? She is just a cleaning girl." "I said she stays." A deep silence filled the kitchen. Aurora stood perfectly still, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Moments ago, she was an invisible woman scrubbing windows. Now, the most powerful man in Chicago was trusting her with his daughter's life. Then Lily did something that made everyone freeze. She smiled. It was small and fragile, but it was a real smile, the first one in 23 days. In the days that followed, the Castellano mansion began to change. It was a slow, quiet transformation, like ice melting under a winter sun. Aurora's first act of defiance was opening the curtains. Heavy drapes had kept Lily's room dark since the funeral, sealing out the world and trapping grief inside. Aurora pulled them back, and golden afternoon light filled the room for the first time in nearly a month. Mrs. Crawford nearly had a stroke when she found wildflowers in a glass on Lily's nightstand. They were common daisies and dandelions from the garden, their cheerful yellow heads next to the machines monitoring Lily's vitals. "Those weeds will attract insects," the housekeeper protested. Aurora just smiled politely and did not move them. Every day, she cooked the same simple soup. Chicken broth simmered for hours, with tiny star-shaped pasta and fresh mint from a plant she had requested. Every day, she sang the old lullabies her grandmother had taught her, the very same songs Elena had once known. These were melodies passed from women who had nothing to give but their love. Lily began to come back. On the first day, she ate half the bowl. Her eyes followed Aurora's every move. By day 3, a touch of pink returned to her pale cheeks. On day 5, she spoke a full sentence. "Aurora, tell me a story." Aurora told her about 2 little girls who grew up on the west side, who used to catch fireflies in mason jars and dream about faraway castles. She never mentioned the other girl's name. There was no need. Franco watched everything. In his study, security monitors showed feeds from all over the mansion, but his eyes were glued to the camera in Lily's room. He watched Aurora build pillow forts on the floor with his daughter. He watched Lily laugh, a genuine laugh. The sound was faint through the speakers, but it was unmistakable. A sound he was sure had died with Elena. Franco wanted to go to them. He wanted to walk through that door, kneel beside his daughter, and join the magic Aurora had created. But his feet felt rooted to the floor. Something held him back. It might have been pride or fear, or a growing feeling he didn't want to name. Jealousy. He was jealous of a cleaning woman, jealous of how easily she had reached his daughter when all his wealth and power had failed. That night, Franco stood outside Lily's door, as he had done so many times. But this time, instead of beeping monitors, he heard singing. Aurora's voice drifted through the wood, soft and warm, weaving an old lullaby. Lily was already asleep. He could hear her steady breathing under the song. For a second, Franco let himself lean against the doorframe and just listen. Then, he heard footsteps in the hall. Vincent appeared, his expression serious. "Boss, you have a visitor. Margaret Whitmore is waiting in the main hall." Franco's face darkened instantly. Margaret, Elena's mother. The woman who had never approved of their marriage, who had tried for years to erase every trace of Elena's simple beginnings. She never visited without a reason, and her reasons were never good. Margaret Whitmore entered the Castellano mansion as if she owned it. At 62 years old, she was perfectly preserved, with platinum blonde hair cut in a sharp bob and a Chanel suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. South Sea pearls were draped around her neck like a declaration of war. Her heels clicked on the marble floor with the precision of a clock, each step announcing her superiority. "The security here is absurd," she stated before Franco could speak. "I was forced to wait at the gate for 7 minutes." 7 minutes, Franco. And no one bothered to tell me my own granddaughter was well enough to see visitors. Franco's jaw tightened. "I was not expecting you, Margaret." A grandmother should not need an appointment to see her grandchild. Her eyes scanned the foyer, taking in every detail, looking for imperfections. I heard through my sources that Lily has improved. I want to see her now. Franco considered saying no. Every bone in his body told him this visit would lead to trouble. But Margaret was Elena's mother, and despite it all, she was legally Lily's grandmother. "Follow me," he said bluntly. They climbed the grand staircase in silence. Margaret's perfume lingered behind her like a toxic fog. Franco led her down the east wing toward the room that had been a tomb just a few days ago. He pushed the door open. The scene inside stopped Margaret cold. Aurora was sitting on the carpet, her hair messy and her uniform stained with watercolor paints. She had her hands up like claws, her face twisted into a mock ferocious expression, growling playfully. And Lily was laughing. The sound filled the room like bells, pure and clear. It was the laugh of a child who had forgotten death existed. She clutched a stuffed rabbit and reached toward Aurora, begging for more. "The monster is going to get you!" Aurora roared, crawling forward on her knees. Lily shrieked with delight and fell backward onto a pile of pillows. Margaret's face contorted, not with joy or relief, but with disgust. "What is this?" Her voice cut through the laughter like a shard of glass. "Why is a servant touching my granddaughter?" The room went quiet. Aurora scrambled to her feet, smoothing her stained uniform and lowering her eyes. "Ma'am, I was not speaking to you," Margaret snapped without a glance in her direction. "Franco, explain this immediately." Lily stopped laughing. She looked at her grandmother with wide, uncertain eyes, then slowly backed away until she was behind Aurora's legs, her small fingers clutching the maid's uniform. She did not run to her grandmother. She hid from her. Margaret saw it. The rejection hit her like a slap across her perfectly made-up face. Her lips pressed into a thin, white line. "Franco, my study, now." She turned and swept out of the room, leaving a chill in the air. In the study, with the door closed and the air thick with tension, Margaret began her attack. "You hired some peasant girl to look after my granddaughter? A child who has Whitmore blood? Do you have any idea who this woman is? Have you run a background check? Verified her credentials?" Franco stood by the window, staring out at the gray Chicago skyline. He said nothing. The truth was, he had not checked. He had not asked questions. He had simply seen his daughter eat for the first time in 23 days and made a decision from the heart instead of the head. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I see. Then allow me to investigate on your behalf." The next morning, at Margaret's urging, Franco called Vincent to his study. The oak-paneled room felt smaller than usual, cramped by the tension. Margaret sat in a leather armchair like a queen awaiting an audience, her manicured fingers drumming on the armrest. Franco stood with his back to them, staring at the clouds building up over the lake. Vincent came in holding a plain file folder. "Do you have the report?" Margaret said before Franco could even say a word. Vincent looked at his boss, got a quick nod, and then opened the folder. Aurora Hayes, age 28, from the west side of Chicago. He turned a page. Her father passed away when she was only 5 years old. He had a heart attack from working too hard at the meatpacking factory. Her mother got married again 2 years later to Dale Simmons. Simmons had a criminal history for public intoxication, hurting his family, and small thefts. A satisfied smile formed on Margaret's lips. "Go on." The mother passed from cancer when Aurora was 16. They had no funds for medical care. Vincent stopped for a second, his tone becoming just slightly gentler. The young woman left her stepfather that same year. She was homeless for a time, taking any small job she could get, from serving tables to cleaning to factory shifts. Franco stood perfectly still by the window, but his shoulders tensed up. She got married at the age of 24. Her husband was Derek Cole. Cole was a gambler who knew the Southside loan sharks. He accumulated $50,000 in debt, then vanished, leaving her to handle the debt. Margaret leaned in, adding that she now owed money to dangerous people. How lovely! Vincent's expression grew stern. There is more. 6 months ago, loan sharks located her. They assaulted her violently. She was 5 months pregnant at the time. She lost the child. A heavy silence filled the space. Even Margaret was speechless. Vincent shut the folder. She is now the only one caring for her grandmother, Martha Hayes, who is 82. She has advanced Alzheimer's. The medication for the elderly woman uses up nearly all of Aurora's earnings. She is late on rent, bills, and everything else. Margaret was the first to speak, her tone pure poison. You understand, Franco. She has debt, criminal associates, and nothing left to lose. Who can say what she really desires from your family? From your money? Franco finally stepped away from the window. His face was an unreadable stone mask. But deep in his eyes, a storm was brewing. He recalled another woman from the West Side, one who was a waitress when he met her, wore second-hand clothes, and dreamt of escaping poverty. A woman Margaret had hated the moment Elena brought her to the house. That woman was his wife, the true love of his life, and the mother of his child. Does she have a police record? Franco asked softly. Vincent shook his head. It is spotless. Not a single parking violation. She is just... He paused, looking for the right words. She is just someone who has had a string of very bad luck. Franco moved to his desk and sank into his chair. He steepled his fingers, gazing at a picture of Elena that seemed to watch over the room. Aurora is staying, he declared. This is my choice. Margaret shot to her feet, her face red with rage. You will come to regret this, Franco. I promise you that. She marched to the door, pulling it open with excessive force. In the hall, Aurora was walking with Lily, hand in hand, toward the garden. The little girl was chattering away, pointing at something outside. Margaret stopped, staring at them. The common girl and the Whitmore heiress, close as a mother and daughter. A cold, calculating smile spread across her face. A scheme was already taking shape. The 3 days Margaret was at the estate were a time of deliberate torment for Aurora. It started with subtle acts of cruelty. Margaret scrunched up her nose when Aurora served Lily some soup. What is that odor? It smells of desperation. Can you not prepare a meal that does not evoke a charity kitchen? Aurora remained silent. She just returned the bowl to the kitchen and brought out another one, exactly the same. During dinner, Margaret made Aurora stand by her chair like a servant, refilling her water, fetching things, and listening to her constant complaints. The older woman never said Aurora's name, instead calling her that woman, or the help, or just gesturing with a bejeweled hand. Aurora tolerated it all for Lily's sake. But what angered Margaret the most was something she could not influence. Lily would not leave Aurora's side. When Margaret tried to hold the child, Lily would pull back. When Margaret tempted her with expensive gifts and shopping sprees, Lily would just shake her head and hide behind Aurora. When Margaret wanted to read a bedtime story, Lily would ask for Aurora to do it. The rejection felt like acid inside Margaret. On her final day, she set her plan in motion. You there, Margaret motioned to Aurora, from the living room. Come and assist me. The fastener on my necklace is jammed. Aurora walked over cautiously. The South Sea pearl necklace was radiant against Margaret's skin. It was a string of glowing orbs, worth more than Aurora could make in 10 lifetimes. Turn around, Aurora said gently. I will try to get it. Her fingers worked at the tiny clasp. In a moment, it came free. There, it is undone. Margaret took off the necklace and glanced at it. Fine, you can go. Aurora went back to Lily, who was busy drawing at a table near the window. She gave the incident no more thought. 15 minutes later, a scream broke the quiet. My necklace! Margaret's voice cried out through the house. Staff rushed in from all over. Franco came out of his office, his expression worried. It is missing. Margaret was in the main hall, a hand on her bare neck. My South Sea pearl necklace. $200,000. Someone took it. Her eyes scanned the staff, then focused on Aurora with intense precision. She was the last person to handle it. Check her. Aurora felt her blood run, cold. I did not do it. Search her now, Mrs. Crawford said, her face stern. Miss Hayes, would you please show us what is in your pockets? Aurora's hands shook as she put them in her apron pocket, the one she had worn all day. The pocket had only held a handkerchief and a ribbon for Lily's hair. Her fingers brushed against something hard and round. She pulled the item out. The South Sea pearls flowed from her pocket, shining in the light, unbelievably beautiful, and absolutely condemning. Mrs. Crawford let out a gasp. Margaret's expression twisted in victory. You see? A thief. I sensed it the moment I met her. Aurora just stared at the jewelry in her hand. She had not stolen it. She had not even touched it after taking it off Margaret. But none of that was important now. She looked to Franco, trying to see the man who had cried in the kitchen, the man who had given her his daughter's life to protect. Their eyes met. His were cold, hard, unreadable steel where compassion had been. Franco approached Aurora, each step on the marble floor sounding like a nail being hammered into a coffin. His gaze moved from the pearls in her shaking hand to her pale, terrified face, then to Margaret, who was dabbing at dry eyes, faking a sadness she did not feel. A war was raging in his mind. Logic told him the proof was right there. The necklace was in her possession. She had debt and a clear motive. The report Vincent gave him showed a desperate person, someone drowning who would do anything to stay afloat. But another voice whispered beneath it all, a quieter one that recalled how Aurora had knelt with his daughter, singing songs that felt like mint and magic. Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts. Call the police, Franco. This woman is a criminal. She needs to be locked away for this. Franco's jaw clenched. The scandal, the headlines. The Castellano name would be ruined in the news. His rivals would enjoy the turmoil. No police, he said. His voice was empty and flat. I will not have my home swarmed by reporters. He looked at Aurora. His eyes were closed off and cold, while hers were full of desperate hope. You have 5 minutes to leave this house. Her words struck like stones hitting glass. Aurora took a step forward, her voice trembling. Sir, please. I did not take it. I swear on my life. I never would. I trusted you. Franco's words sliced through her pleas like a razor. I gave you my daughter, and your payment was betrayal. I did not. 5 minutes, starting now. Aurora stood motionless, the pearls still in her hand. Mrs. Crawford came over and snatched them from her grasp, treating them like holy objects tainted by her touch. With slow movements, Aurora untied her apron. She folded it perfectly, one last act of dignity before her world fell apart, and placed it on the marble table. She started walking to the front door. Then, a scream echoed through the entire house. Aurora! No! Lily was at the top of the huge staircase, her feet bare and her face wet with tears. She had heard it all through the vents that carried every sound in the old home. The little girl raced down the stairs, almost falling, her small legs moving as fast as they could. She slammed into Aurora's legs, hugging them with all her might. Do not go, Mommy. Do not go. Aurora's breath caught in her throat. Mommy. That word hung there in the air, like a blessing and a curse. Franco just stared at his daughter. His little girl, who had not called anyone Mommy since Elena's death, was now clinging to the cleaning lady as if she were the only thing holding her world together. His heart didn't just break, it shattered into a million pieces on the marble floor. Margaret seized the opportunity. You see? Her words were coated in poison. She has manipulated the child, twisting a grieving 4-year-old for her own benefit. This woman is a danger, Franco. Franco looked at Lily's tear-covered face, at Aurora's shaking hands, and then at Margaret's triumphant smile, which she barely hid behind fake worry. He felt crushed by the pressure from every side. Doubt flooded his mind. Fear tightened its grip around his neck. He did what any trapped animal would do. He attacked. "Get out!" The command exploded from deep inside him. "Get out of my house this instant!" Aurora flinched like she had been physically hit. Very gently, she unhooked Lily's fingers from her legs. The child shrieked, reaching for her, but a maid came and picked Lily up, carrying her off as she kicked and screamed. Aurora went to the door. She opened it. Outside, rain was pouring down from a black sky. Thunder rumbled over Lake Michigan, sounding like drums of an approaching war. She stepped outside. The big oak door slammed shut right behind her, silencing Lily's cries and locking Aurora out in the middle of the storm. She had no umbrella, no cash, and no place to live. She just walked into the night. The rain soaked her thin uniform as she went on with nowhere to go, and with absolutely nothing left to lose. The Castellano mansion fell apart 3 hours after Aurora disappeared into the storm. It started with a fever. Lily's temperature soared to 104 degrees within an hour of the door shutting. The medical staff that Franco had sent away came speeding back, called by frantic phone calls. They discovered the little girl seizing in her bed, her body shaking with tremors that no medicine seemed to touch. Then, she just stopped moving. Dr. Webb stayed up all night, his old hands checking her vitals, changing intravenous lines, and giving her drugs that had no effect. The monitors kept beeping their urgent alarms. Nurses whispered in the corners, their glances filled with fear. By midnight, Lily was unconscious, her breathing faint and difficult, her skin as pale as paper. Franco sat by her bed, holding her small hand in both of his. His own fingers were trembling so badly he could hardly keep his grip. The powerful mafia boss was now just an empty shell of a man, watching his daughter fade away for a second time. "I just do not get it, doctor," Webb confessed, his voice heavy with weariness and bafflement. She was getting better. She was stable. Then that woman left, and in a matter of hours, he just shook his head. "It is almost like her body just decided to give up." Franco said nothing. He could not speak. Lily's dry lips started to move, trying to form words he could not hear. He moved in closer, putting his ear right next to her mouth. "Aurora, Aurora, Mommy." The names came again and again like a broken record, a repeating loop in her feverish state. Even unconscious, even near death, his daughter was calling for the woman he had thrown out into the storm. Margaret was standing in a corner of the room with her arms crossed, her face fixed in a look of motherly worry. But Franco saw something that cut through his haze of despair. Her eyes did not match the rest of her face. Behind the worried frown and tight lips, he saw a spark of something else, something sharp and pleased. Triumph. The thought hit Franco like a punch right in his gut. Why wasn't Margaret truly devastated? Her own granddaughter was dying. Her only link to her deceased daughter was slipping away in front of her. But underneath all the pretend concern, Margaret Whitmore had the look of someone who had just won. Franco let go of Lily's hand. He got up slowly, his joints protesting, his body suddenly feeling the weight of his 37 years. "Boss." Vincent came out from the shadows. "Where are you heading?" Franco didn't reply. He walked out of Lily's room, going past the nurses, the medical machines, and the portraits of his ancestors who had built a dynasty on violence and intimidation. His steps led him down the east wing to a door he had not touched since the day they put his wife in the ground. Elena's study. He had locked it the day after her funeral and had tossed the key. Everything inside was just as she had left it. Her books, her pictures, her secrets. Franco paused at the door, his hand shaking as it hovered over the brass knob. He knew that opening this door meant he would have to confront everything he had been avoiding. The sorrow, the blame, and the truth about the woman he had just banished into the night. And maybe, if Elena had left some part of herself behind, he would find the answers he so badly needed. His hand wrapped around the knob. As the door swung open, It felt as if Elena Castellano's spirit washed over Franco's face. Her perfume was still there, so faint it was almost not real, but he knew it. The smell of gardenias and vanilla that once felt like home, like love, like being safe. Now, it only meant what he had lost. Franco walked into the study as if he were entering a sacred tomb. Not one thing had been moved since her death. Her books were still on the shelves in their perfect order. Her paintbrushes sat in a clay pot on the desk, their ends hard with old paint. Pictures of their family in silver frames smiled at him. Elena holding Lily as a newborn. Elena on their wedding day. Elena laughing under the summer sun. Franco slid his fingers along the spines of her books, wiping away the dust that had settled there like a soft blanket. He had no idea what he was searching for. He just knew he needed a piece of her, something from Elena that could help him find his way through this suffocating darkness. His hand paused on a little wooden box hidden behind some poetry books. He took it out and placed it on her desk. The hinges moaned as he opened the lid. Inside was a small bundle of letters tied together with an old ribbon. Franco's heart skipped a beat. He untied the ribbon and laid the letters out on the desk. Most were letters to Elena from her friends and relatives, but one envelope stood out. It was a letter Elena had written but had not mailed. The address on it was for Aurora Hayes, Southside, Chicago. Franco's blood turned to ice. With shaking hands, he opened the paper. Elena's handwriting covered the page, so painfully familiar it was like she was talking to him from her grave. My dearest cousin, Aurora, I know you are going through a terrible time. I wish there was more I could do to help you. But Franco, he just does not get it. He believes money is the answer to everything. He has no idea that some hurts require love, not money. I have been making Grandma's chicken soup for Lily. Do you remember how to make it? The star-shaped pasta, the fresh mint, cooked on low for a long time. Lily is completely hooked on it. Whenever she feels sick, that is the only thing she wants to eat. Nothing else will do. Aurora, if I am ever not here, please go find Lily. You are the one person I would trust to love her just like I do. The only one who gets where we are from, and what is truly important. Franco is a good man. His heart is just buried very deep. But you will find it one day. I am sure of it. I love you, little cousin. I always will, Elena. The letter slipped right out of Franco's fingers. It drifted down to the floor like a single falling leaf. Aurora was Elena's cousin, her own family. She was the woman Elena trusted more than anyone to look after their daughter. And Franco had thrown her out into a storm. The reality of it all crashed down on him like a massive wave hitting the shore. The soup, the lullabies, the immediate bond between Aurora and Lily. It all made sense because they shared the same blood, the same memories, the same grandmother who taught them how to cook with affection. Franco hadn't just hired a random person that morning. Fate had brought his wife's final wish directly to him, and he had thrown it away like trash. A roar of pure agony tore out of his throat. Vincent! The door flew open, and his right-hand man appeared, his eyes wide with concern. Franco was already up, moving across the room in 3 long steps. Find her! Find Aurora! Now! He then burst through the mansion's main door into the violent storm. Rain whipped his face like sharp needles. Thunder boomed, making the very ground shake. He did not grab a coat. He did not grab a thing. Vincent ran behind him, yelling above the wind. "Sir, I should drive. You cannot go alone." Franco paid him no mind. He raced to the garage, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet stones, his $1,000 suit completely drenched. He had his phone to his ear before he got to the car. "Mrs. Crawford, I need the personnel file for Aurora Hayes. I need her address immediately." He listened, committed it to memory, then ended the call. Vincent reached him just as Franco jumped into the driver's side of a black sport utility vehicle. The engine roared awake, Vincent had barely gotten in the passenger door before Franco hit the gas, sending the truck speeding away. They drove through the storm as if they were possessed. The windshield wipers could not keep up with the downpour. Lightning briefly lit the deserted streets in blinding flashes. Franco held the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, pushing the truck through flooded intersections that would have stopped any reasonable driver. In Southside, the area changed as they went over unseen borders. The fine brownstones of the north were replaced by decaying apartment buildings. Streetlights were either flickering or out completely. Potholes were now enormous craters. Then the pavement ended. A muddy river was flowing across the street, too deep and dangerous to drive through. Franco hit the brakes. "We will have to find another way," Vincent started to say. Franco was already out of the truck. He charged into the floodwater without pausing, wading through knee-deep mire that pulled at his Italian shoes. The rain stuck his hair to his head. His ruined suit was spattered with mud. He did not notice. He ran along the flooded streets, banging on doors, shouting at shocked faces in the windows. "Aurora Hayes. Do you know an Aurora Hayes? Where is her house?" He got confused looks, slammed doors, and distrustful stares. At last, an older woman in a worn shawl opened her door a crack. The young woman with the sick grandmother. She looked closely at Franco, at his expensive, now filthy clothes, and at the desperation etched on his face. She had been kicked out last week. Her landlord put her on the street. A neighbor mentioned the old abandoned church at the end of the block. Franco took off running. The church stood at the end of a dead end, a decaying Gothic building with boarded-up windows and a collapsed roof. The door dangled from rusted hinges. Franco shoved his way inside where the darkness was total. Rain hammered on the remaining roof, dripping from 100 different spots. Broken pews were scattered about like fallen soldiers. In a corner, huddled by the altar, was a figure, Aurora. She was soaked completely, shivering hard, her thin uniform useless against the cold. She clutched a worn photograph to her chest, shielding it from the rain with her own body. It showed two little girls smiling in the sun. Franco moved across the ruined space and fell to his knees in front of her. Muddy water soaked his pants, but he did not feel it. "Aurora." His voice caught on her name. "I know, I found Elena's letter. I know who you really are." Aurora slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen, and completely empty of anything but pain and exhaustion. "What do you know?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "That I am a thief? Or that I am the poor cousin Elena had to keep from you because you would have judged me just like you did on that first day?" Franco bowed his head. "I know I do not deserve to be forgiven," he murmured. "But Lily is dying. She keeps calling for you. Please," his voice cracked. "Please come home. She needs you." Aurora just stared at the man on his knees before her, the feared mafia boss of South Chicago, kneeling in the mud of her old neighborhood. Rain and tears mixed on his face, impossible to tell apart. She was quiet for a long time. In her head, she heard Elena's voice from years ago. "Franco has a kind heart. It is just buried very deep." She pictured Lily, her small hand reaching out, her chapped lips whispering the word mommy. Aurora shut her eyes. "I am not coming back for you," she finally said. Her voice was firm even as the cold bit into her. "I am coming back for Lily, and for the promise I made to Elena." Franco nodded, his head still low. "I understand." He stood up and offered his hand to help her. After a brief pause, Aurora accepted it. They drove back in silence as the storm raged. The rain seemed to lessen as they entered the wealthy northern suburbs, as if the weather itself knew about class lines. Lights from the mansion blazed in the dark when they arrived. It was 4 in the morning. Aurora did not even wait for the car to stop. She jumped out and ran inside, rushing past surprised servants, up the main staircase, and down the east hall to Lily's room. The girl was motionless in her bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and worried nurses. Her skin was as white as a sheet, her breathing faint and choppy. Aurora was across the room in 3 steps. She got onto the bed and gathered Lily's small body into her embrace, holding the child close as she began to sing. The old lullaby poured from her lips. It was the melody their grandmother taught her and Elena long ago. The song smelled of chicken soup and pasta stars, and a love that cost nothing and was worth everything. Lily began to move. Her eyelids fluttered, her small fingers twitched, and then they wrapped around Aurora's arm. Aurora, the whisper was almost silent. You came home. Aurora kissed Lily's forehead, her own tears now flowing freely. I will never leave you again, my love. Never. Franco stood at the door, watching the two of them on the bed, his daughter and her cousin. This was the family Elena had always wanted for him, the family he had been too stubborn to see. The morning was gray and still. Franco called Margaret into his study. She entered with her usual arrogant air, expecting to be praised. But Elena's letter was on the desk, and the color drained from her face as she read it. Get out of my house, Franco said. His voice had no anger, only a cold, hard finality. Do not ever come back. Margaret started to argue, but Vincent was suddenly at her side, his hand firmly on her arm. This way, Mrs. Whitmore. She was led to her car without any fanfare. The gate slammed shut behind her with a loud clang. A new silence fell over the mansion, but for the first time in 23 days, it was not the quiet of grief. It was peace. 6 months later, spring arrived in Chicago. Tulips bloomed in the Castellano Gardens, a stunning display of red, yellow, and purple where death's shadow had lingered. The mansion was no longer a tomb. Sunlight streamed through the open curtains, fresh flowers brightened every room, and more importantly, laughter now echoed in hallways that had only known sadness. Lily raced across the lawn, her cheeks pink with happiness, her dark hair flowing behind her like a banner of new life. She chased a butterfly, her giggles floating on the spring air like a song. In the kitchen, Aurora stood over the stove, stirring a pot that smelled like home. She was no longer wearing the maid's uniform. She had on a simple floral dress, and her hair was down around her shoulders. The yellow rubber gloves were gone for good. She hummed the old lullaby while she cooked, adding star-shaped pasta to the pot. Footsteps came up behind her, and strong arms circled her waist. Franco put his chin on her shoulder, taking in the smell of mint, chicken, and home. What is so special about the soup today? He whispered in her ear. Aurora smiled, a small secret on her lips. There is 1 extra star in there today, for a new member of our family. Franco went still. Aurora turned to face him, then took his hand and placed it on her stomach, over a tiny curve that was just beginning to show. Lily is going to have a baby brother or sister. Franco, the powerful mob boss who had ordered hits without batting an eye, felt tears running down his face. These were not tears of sadness, or anger, or desperation. They were tears of pure, overwhelming joy. Before he could find his voice, the kitchen door flew open. Daddy! Aurora, look what I found! Lily ran in, her hands cupped around something delicate. She opened her palms and showed them a beautiful butterfly with orange and black wings. It landed right on my finger, like it was magic. Franco scooped his daughter up in one arm and pulled Aurora in with the other. The three of them stood there in the bright, sunny kitchen. They were a family made not just by blood, but by love, by loss, and by the gift of second chances. On a nearby counter, a silver photo frame seemed to watch over them. Elena was smiling from inside the glass, her eyes full of warmth and peace, as if she had planned this outcome all along. This story teaches us that love is something money and power can never buy. The best doctors and the fanciest chefs could not heal Lily, but a simple soup made with love brought her back from the edge. Sometimes the biggest miracles start in the most humble ways. It also shows us that family is not just about blood relatives. Aurora and Lily had a connection that was stronger than DNA. It was a bond created from caring, sacrifice, and the bravery to love even when it hurts. And finally, it shows that anyone can be redeemed. Franco had locked his heart away behind his pride and his pain. But when he finally knelt in the mud and asked to be forgiven, he learned that it is never too late to make a change. If this story resonated with you, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel so you will not miss our next video. Please share this with someone who needs to hear it. We are curious. What comfort food from your mother or grandmother always makes you feel better? For the Castellano family, it was chicken soup with little pasta stars. What is yours? Please let us know in a comment below. We read all of your messages, and your stories encourage us to continue making content that brings us all together. Thank you for being here with us. We wish you good health, lasting happiness, and peace in your life. May you always be able to find your own star, even on the darkest of nights. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.